Hey everybody, this is John the Other, obviously, and I'm going to read something to you. This is an article I'm writing. It'll be published on Community Organized Compassion and Kindness within a day or so. I'll put a link in the low bar when that happens. The image, though, that you're looking at of a dandelion blowing, it is my choice of an image signifying MGTOW. Now, usually the MGTOW iconography is the standard branching road, going on a different path and so on. I understand the meaning of that. I think it is too limited. I'm not telling anybody they need to adopt my image, but I'm just saying my view of MGTOW is not of walking down a road and departing, going down a side road. I see it more of it's a diaspora. It is an exodus, but not in one direction. It is an exodus in 100 directions, in 1,000 directions, which is why I prefer to use the dandelion image as sort of the signifying visual representation of the MGTOW phenomena. Anyway, that's just little rambling thoughts off the top of my head. I'm going to read you the article now. I'm probably going to call this Abandoners and Reformers. Here we go. Marriage is sometimes called the fundamental building block of civilization. That might be arrogating it to a position higher than it merits, but it certainly is the legal and social construct establishing what most people have called their families for at least the past few hundred years. Despite a growing number of people born outside of the legal framework of families formed by marriage, marriage is clearly the way our culture handles the formation of what we call a family. Even as the details and the legal obligations and the format of marriage change over time, marriage remains right in the middle of our culture's mainstream. It's normal, it's standard, and it's a well-worn, established pathway people choose for themselves to shape their lives. However, our culture's mainstream, including its social and legal obligations and cultural pressures, are increasingly recognized by some men, and indeed some women, as a particularly bad deal for men. Suicide rates, workplace death rates, homelessness, rates of mental illness, violent criminal victimization, and a collection of other metrics all seem to indicate that our society's obligations and expectations of men add up to a powerfully destructive ethic of disregard for their lives, their happiness, and their well-being. Some men, recognizing these facts, have elected to argue in protest and a campaign for change and reform of what they see as unjust and harmful aspects of our society's male-facing expectations. Many of these individuals refer to themselves as men's rights activists or men's rights advocates. Now, another group, similarly concerned with the raw deal that is afforded to men, select for themselves an alternative strategy. Rather than canvassing and agitating for reform, they have chosen to simply reject many of the usually unexamined obligations and inequities that our society requires of men. And these individuals tend to follow a highly individualistic path. And I believe they're better described by the phrase social phenomenon rather than social movement. However, as individualistic as these varied paths may be, they share a common thread of rejecting the male-facing social inequities the mainstream of our culture accepts without thought. The individuals in this group address the problems facing men by forging new paths for male self-actualization, which eschew identified male disadvantage in cultural institutions. Individuals choosing this path, rejecting self-destructive and gynocentric conventions, often refer to themselves as men going their own way. And in this context, the most significant of these gynocentric institutions is marriage. But we need to examine marriage in its modern format to understand why this is so. On the surface, marriage is the legal recognition and the formalization of a friendly, cooperative partnership between two people for the purpose of establishing a family. The two people are typically both adults, they're typically of complementary sex, and typically expected to periodically jump each other's bones, with the eventual outcome of cranking off little copies of themselves and spamming their immediate surroundings with these little mini copies. Obviously, there's a lot of flexibility in this definition. The two people might be the same sex. They might not decide to spam their DNA carelessly around. They might not even be into humping one another. But all of that is just a surface reading of what marriage is in the modern context. If we expand our vision to see how marriage fits into the culture it occurs in, we must also consider the role within marriage of civic, regional, and state institutions of government, law enforcement agencies, financial institutions, culturally enforced social obligations, social services agencies, child care intervention agencies, and a whole cavalcade of interested groups and organizations. In the modern context, a man participating in a marriage is not just getting together with his female friend for the mutual benefit of shared housing, shared bed, shared investment in property and procreation. No. He's actually agreeing to and inviting all those government organizations into his partnership with his female friend, and those institutions and organizations are, for the most part, acting to enforce her interests, not his. He is signing a contract which says she is his boss, with a whole array of organized, powerful, and in some cases, armed enforcers backing her up. Of course, not all women are tyrants. A woman finding herself in such a position of power might elect to not pull the trigger on the metaphorical gun this system puts in her hand. She might elect to always resolve disagreement with her husband fairly, equitably, and without recourse to the power that system puts at her disposal. But regardless of whether it is called on, the power is there. She has it. He does not. But examining these two groups of men, those whose approach is in canvassing, petitioning, and agitating for reform, and those who elect to abandon and avoid self-destructive and gynocentric social institutions and conventions, and who opt instead to create their own individualistic pathways outside of the already established socially mainstream gynocentric pathways, there is an emerging conflict. We can call these two groups, these two approaches, the reformers and the abandoners. Now, those are not the names the groups in question use, obviously. I have renamed them for this discussion because labels used too commonly can obstruct understanding of what they each refer to. At present, the most vocal and high-profile figures in the reformer group are arguing strenuously that, by God, they are also members of the abandoner group, and to hell with anybody who says differently. The highest profile members in the abandoner phenomenon have taken considerable umbrage with this reformer movement claim. Many practitioners of the abandoner phenomenon regard the claim by reformers of inclusion in the definition of abandoner as an attempt to hijack and subvert the impact and the efficacy of the practice and identity of membership in the abandoner phenomenon. They see it as a very serious betrayal of the sacrifice and the work done within the abandoner phenomenon, and they see it as a deliberate undermining of an emerging project of masculine self-definition. There are a number of speculations about the motives for this perceived undermining of the abandoner phenomenon, and a few of those will be addressed later in this discussion. On the other side of this argument, members of the reformer movement, those who insist that they damn well are abandoners too, have a collection of complaints about the vocal rejection of themselves from the accepted definition of the abandoner phenomenon. Some of these complaints honestly appear born more out of hurt feelings than logic, and look on their face a little bit silly. I'm going to characterize them. Abandoners rejecting our broadened definition of their phenomenon are equivalent to fascists and social justice warriors. Well, we will just leave that alone, because there are several other more serious complaints. One of which relies on the common label applied to the practitioners of what in this discussion we have been calling the abandoner phenomenon, men going their own way. What if a man, of his own free will and by his own choice, decides himself that the best thing for him is to sign on the dotted line and take the path of marriage? If he chooses it himself, is that not definitionally his own way? Well, sure, but only so long as we willfully suspend our understanding that marriage is a foundational feature of the mainstream way in our society, and suspend our understanding that departure from mainstream gynocentric convention is the identifying feature of the abandoner phenomenon. But sure, in this reading, a man agreeing to and inviting the intrusion of coercive gynocentric public institutions into his life can be said to be going his own way because he selected it for himself. Sure, okay. But as soon as we accept this definition, then by whatever label we are going to use, going his own way or abandoning gynocentric convention or whatever, we have made the label mean nothing in particular. It's just a string of syllables which signifies no distinction from everybody else in the world who quietly follows conventional thinking without examination. And this is why the practitioners of the abandoner phenomenon take such umbrage at the argument that men can choose to follow the mainstream conventional path, getting themselves married, while at the same time laying claim to membership in the social phenomenon of abandoning that conventional path. They see that claim as a purposeful and deliberate co-option and subversion of the integrity of the social phenomenon, abandoning mainstream gynocentrism. They see this claim coming from members of a movement which recognizes mainstream gynocentrism and whose members are obviously aware of how their claim to the abandoner identity will be perceived by its practitioners. To those practitioners, it's a profound betrayal, and they are rather annoyed by it. But returning to the other side of the argument, on the reformer side of this dispute, it's clear that the abandoner phenomenon, occurring in the real world and actually quite indifferent to both positive and negative critiques from social commentators like me and others, that abandoner phenomenon is having a noticeable effect on public discourse. In short, people within the mainstream gynocentric social institutions are demonstrating a real fear of the longer-term impact of continued growth of the abandoner phenomenon. And this type of recognition from the mainstream is something the reformer camp has worked very, very, very hard to achieve. It is what they believe they need in order to be a relevant movement. The claim, then, from high-profile members of the reformer part of this movement, that they, too, are part of the abandoner phenomenon, is understandable. It's a deep emotional need. But it's also a political need. Because in the present evolution of the reformer subset of the wider men's movement, having a visible share of the public podium is a matter of great importance to them. As long as a great many men still participate in marriage, the leaders of the reformer part of the men's movement feel like their relevance is diminished if it becomes established fact that the thing the mainstream is so visibly shaken by excludes most of those men who are married. And that's a hard place to be. And I also can't solve that problem for them because I am no longer a part of that camp. The present strategy that we see, that of laying claim to the abandoner identity and putting the most visibly and obviously destructive gynocentric social institution within the accepted domain of abandoner practice, is, in my view, a short-sighted political move. Unfortunately, it's a move calculated to appeal to the mainstream as an authoritative voice on the abandoner phenomena while sacrificing the meaning of the practice of those who comprise the abandoner phenomenon. There is always the possibility that those inside the reformer section of the men's movement can't actually see the impact that their dilution of the meaning of abandoning gynocentric social institutions has to the identity of those who the MGTOW label actually describes. Maybe the departure from the institution of marriage by their former colleagues seems like an existential threat to the reformer subset of the men's movement. So maybe out of a sense of desperation, they lay claim to that label without seeing the subversion of it that they are practicing. On the other hand, possibly after having had a taste of mainstream relevance, the need for continued claim of authority in these matters, including expertise on the topic of men cutting a new path for themselves, is so important that sacrificing those men for popular appeal seems like a minor price to pay. I won't claim I can see inside anybody's head, and all of this is just speculation.